In December 1237, Batu Khan's army sat motionless on the frontier of the Kievan Rus, not retreating, waiting for the rivers to freeze. Most people think winter stopped medieval armies cold. Snow buried the roads. Rivers flooded and thawed into mud. Campaigns paused until spring. That belief holds for almost every army in history. It does not hold for the Mongols. They watched the temperature drop below -40°C, and they moved. Frozen rivers became highways. Natural barriers turned into invasion routes. Within 8 weeks, 5 major principalities had fallen, and European princes who expected a spring war found themselves under siege in the dead of winter. The evidence for how they pulled this off survives in the historical record itself, in campaign accounts, surviving equipment, and the accounts of the terrified kingdoms who watched it happen. This was not a lucky season. It was a complete system, engineered piece by piece, tested and repeated across generations, built to turn the harshest cold on Earth into a weapon nobody else could survive, let alone fight through. Every defensive choke point those kingdoms had spent centuries building simply stopped mattering once the ice took hold. Here is how they built it, and what it actually took to stay alive out there. 14 years before that army sat waiting on the frontier, Mongol generals had already tested the idea. In 1223, at a river called the Kalka, a force of 20,000 Mongol riders lured a much larger army of Rus princes and their allies into a 9-day chase, then turned and destroyed them. The Mongols pulled back afterward, but they had learned something no one else on the battlefield understood yet. These kingdoms were divided. Their armies moved slowly, and the rivers that protected them could be turned into weapons with nothing more than cold weather. So when the full invasion came in 1237, it came in winter on purpose. Sedentary kingdoms needed grain stores, firewood, and fortified winter camps just to survive the season, let alone fight in it. Their armies stopped moving once the snow came. The Mongols had no such limit. Their horses grazed straight through snow. Their food fit in a saddlebag. Their shelters went up in under an hour, and the frozen rivers, which had been impossible to cross only weeks earlier during the autumn floods, became the fastest roads available to them. Ryazan fell in December. Kolomna and Moscow fell in January. Vladimir and Suzdal fell in February. 5 cities, each one built around the assumption that winter bought them time. None of them got any. The force that did this was not small. Historians place the invasion column somewhere between 30 and 50,000 mounted warriors, all of them positioned on the frontier for weeks before a single horse crossed the ice. Scouts had already mapped the terrain in detail. Supply arrangements were already set. The only thing the Mongols were missing was the cold itself, and they were willing to sit and wait for it rather than move a single day early. A Mongol warrior riding at -40 degrees burned about 3,600 calories a day just to keep his body from eating its own muscle. That is the cost of staying alive in that cold. No wagon train could keep up with that kind of demand across hundreds of miles of frozen steppe. So the Mongols did not try to carry food. They shrank it down to almost nothing instead. The centerpiece was something called borts. Warriors took lean strips of beef, horse, or camel meat and hung them up during the coldest part of winter, when the dry, freezing air pulled the moisture out without letting the meat rot. All the fat was stripped away first, because fat spoils. What was left dried into something like hard wood. Then it was pounded into powder and packed into a cleaned animal stomach. Picture this. An entire cow, once processed, fit inside something the size of a canteen. It weighed only a few kilograms. That powder was almost 80% pure protein, and it carried nearly 4,000 calories in every kilogram. That is roughly 10 times the energy of the same weight in fresh meat. A warrior would drop a small piece into boiling water, And in minutes, he had a full meal. No cooking, no waste. No long fire that could give away his position for miles. Alongside the meat powder, warriors carried arul, hard blocks of dried cheese curd. In summer, when milk was plentiful, curds were spread across the sloped felt roofs of the gers and left to bake in the sun until they turned rock hard. On a long ride, a soldier dropped a few of these into a leather bag filled with water and hung it from his saddle. The rhythm of the horse's gait churned the bag for hours, slowly breaking the hard cheese down into a thick, sour drink. He never had to stop moving to eat. Mare's milk could not be turned into cheese, so it was fermented instead into a drink called arag. This gave warriors vitamin C during long months with no fresh food, which kept them from developing scurvy. It needed no cooking at all. Then there was the option nobody expects. When fires were banned completely, on deep scouting missions, or when the enemy was close enough to see smoke, warriors turned to their horses one more time. A small, precise cut was made in the vein of one of the spare mounts. The warrior drank several mouthfuls of warm blood straight from the animal, then sealed the small wound with saliva and dirt. Because each rider cycled through 5 to 8 horses, no single animal was ever weakened by this. The practice alone could keep a man moving for up to 10 days without a single fire and without a single bite of solid food. This was calculated down to the last detail. Every drop of that blood carried iron, salt, and protein the body could use immediately. It was never meant to replace a full meal. It was meant to prevent collapse in the exact moments when staying hidden mattered more than staying full. Step back and look at what this actually eliminated. Every other army in the medieval world was chained to its supply train. European forces needed wagons of grain and salted pork, which moved slowly and had to be guarded. Chinese armies needed rice, which had to be milled and cooked over open fire. Both of those systems left a visible trail that could be tracked, ambushed, or starved out. The Mongols carried an entire food supply in their saddlebags. They ate without stopping. They cooked without smoke. And when they needed to vanish completely, they drank from the animals they rode and left nothing behind to prove they had ever been there. That alone should change how you think about what it takes to move an army through true winter. But the food was only step one. What they did to protect the body once an arrow found it is stranger still. Mongol armor had to solve a problem that European and Chinese armies never even had to think about. Metal freezes faster than skin. Iron mail and plate did not just feel cold. At -40 degrees, metal pulled heat away from the body so fast that soldiers wearing it developed frostbite exactly where the metal touched their skin. Worse, the metal itself stiffened in the cold, locking up joints at the exact moment speed and flexibility could save a warrior's life. So the Mongols built their defense almost entirely out of leather, wool, and one surprising material most people would never expect to see on a battlefield: silk. The outer layer of Mongol armor was made of small, overlapping plates of hardened leather, laced together so the whole piece could bend and twist without restricting a warrior's ability to draw a bow. Underneath that sat a thick, quilted wool coat lined with sheepskin, which cushioned blows and kept the cold away from the body's core. That part makes sense to most people. Leather and wool are obvious choices for warmth and protection. The silk is where the real engineering was hiding. Mongol warriors wore raw silk undershirts beneath everything else, brought back from campaigns in northern China. This was not decoration. It was medicine, sewn directly into the clothing. Here is why it mattered so much. When a fast-spinning arrow, fired from a bow that could generate 100 pounds of force, struck a warrior's chest, it would normally punch straight through leather and wool without slowing down. But when it hit the silk layer, something different happened. Silk fibers are incredibly strong for how thin they are. Instead of tearing apart, the tightly woven threads wrapped around the arrowhead as it pushed through, dragging an intact sleeve of cloth into the wound along with it. That single detail changed everything about what happened next. First, the silk sealed the wound from the inside. Dirt, rust, and loose fibers from the wool coat, the exact things that caused deadly infections in that era, were physically blocked from entering the body. In a time when infection killed more soldiers than the arrow itself, this one layer of fabric saved lives that no doctor could have saved otherwise. Second, it solved the worst part of an arrow wound. Battlefield arrowheads often had backward-facing barbs, designed to tear the wound wider on the way out if anyone tried to pull them free. Wrapped in silk, those barbs never touched the flesh directly. The cloth absorbed the damage the barbs were built to cause. Third, it made removing the arrow almost simple. A field medic did not need to cut the warrior open or push the arrow all the way through the body, which was often the only other option available at the time. He simply grabbed the edge of the silk fabric around the entry point and pulled. The arrow slid out along the cloth, leaving a clean wound that could be treated on the spot. Nobody stumbled into this by accident. It was a designed system where a piece of clothing did the work of a surgical tool, centuries before anyone had the science to explain why it worked. Most armies of that era treated an arrow wound as a death sentence waiting to happen. The Mongols had already turned it into something they could walk away from. Keeping a warrior alive was only half the problem, though. Keeping him warm enough to fight in the first place meant solving the horse underneath him. Every Mongol warrior rode into battle with 5 to 8 horses. None of them were spares sitting idle in the back. They were part of a working system, almost like a fuel rotation built out of living animals. A rider would use one horse for a stretch of the journey, then switch his saddle to a fresh mount and let the tired horse run loose with the herd. That horse could rest its muscles and graze while still keeping pace with the army. European knights rode a single war horse until it collapsed. Then they stopped moving entirely. Mongol columns never had to stop. By constantly cycling through mounts, no single horse ever reached exhaustion, which is how the army covered up to 120 kilometers in a single day without destroying the herd that made it all possible. None of this worked without the right horse for the job. The Mongol horse was short, stocky, and built for exactly this kind of punishment. Its coat grew in 2 layers, a thick outer shell over a soft undercoat almost like felt, which meant these horses needed no blankets and no barns. They stood outside through temperatures that would have killed a European war horse, and they simply survived. When snow buried the grass, the horses did not wait to be fed. They practiced something called tebenevka, pawing through crusted ice with their bare, unshod hooves to reach the dried grass hidden underneath. This single behavior meant the army never had to carry hay or grain for its horses at all, no matter how deep the column pushed into hostile territory. When there was no water nearby, the horses drank snow instead, which meant the army never had to camp near a river or lake, a detail enemy scouts often relied on to track them down. The Mongols could disappear onto open steppe with no water source in sight, and their horses kept them fed and hydrated anyway. But the most surprising part of this system had nothing to do with riding at all. It was about staying alive at night. When a blizzard hit suddenly, or the army needed to move too fast to set up full shelter, warriors slept beside their horses. The animals were tied in tight circles to form a living windbreak, and warriors lay on the ground directly against their bellies. A single horse generates about 1,500 watts of body heat. Pressed against that much warmth in freezing wind, A man could survive conditions that would have killed him in an open bedroll within hours. There was a second benefit built into this arrangement. The lead rope was tied directly to the warrior's wrist. If the horse sensed danger, a predator, an enemy scout shifting ice under its feet, it would pull on that rope and wake the sleeping soldier instantly. The animal was not just a heater. It doubled as a living alarm system, one that never slept as deeply as the man tied to it. Inside the gers, this same logic went even further. Young lambs, calves, and goat kids were brought inside during the coldest stretches, and their body heat alone raised the temperature enough to cut down on how much fuel was needed to stay warm. Camp dogs curled up at the entrances and around the feet of sleeping warriors, acting as both sentries and heaters at the same time. None of this was affection. Every warm-blooded animal near a sleeping warrior added to the total heat available to the group, and the Mongols measured that the same way they measured everything else, as a resource to be managed, not a comfort to be enjoyed. The horse had stopped being transportation. It had become food, warmth, and an early warning system, all carrying a rider. But an army sleeping under animals in open wind still needed a wall between itself and a true blizzard. And that wall is where the last piece of the system stood waiting. None of this worked without a place to sleep that could survive a night at -50 degrees. That place was the gers, and calling it a tent does not come close to describing what it actually was. European soldiers slept in rectangular canvas tents that collapsed under heavy snow and let heat leak out through every seam and corner. The Mongols built something completely different, a circular dome designed from the ground up to survive wind and cold that would tear a normal shelter apart. The shape came first, and the shape mattered more than people realize. A low, rounded dome gave the Arctic wind nothing flat to push against. Gusts that could reach 60 kilometers an hour simply flowed around the curved surface instead of slamming into it directly. A rectangular tent had no such advantage. The wind caught its flat walls dead on and tore them loose from their stakes. The frame underneath that dome was its own kind of engineering. Warriors used flexible wood, usually larch, birch, or willow, light enough to carry on horseback, but strong enough to hold real weight. The walls were made from folding lattice panels called kana. These opened into full circular sections on site and folded flat again for travel. Roof poles called uni slotted into a compression ring at the very top, called the tuno. Thick braided horsehair bands wrapped around the structure to hold the outward pressure of the roof in place, locking the whole dome into rigid balance. A team of 5 to 15 warriors could raise the entire skeleton in about 30 minutes. Then came the part that actually kept people alive: the felt. Sheep wool for these walls was not woven like normal fabric. It was beaten and pressed until the fibers locked together into a single dense sheet, then treated with animal fat until it turned completely windproof and water-resistant. In winter, warriors layered up to 8 of these felt panels over the wooden frame, building roughly 80 millimeters of insulation in total. That thickness is the whole reason a small fire-burning dried dung inside could hold the interior at 25 degrees, even when the air outside sat at -40 or worse. That is a temperature difference of 65 degrees, held by a portable structure built entirely from wood and wool. At the very top sat the tuno, which could be sealed or opened with a felt flap called the urg, depending on the conditions. Sealed, the gr became an airtight thermal capsule. Opened, it let smoke escape without flooding the space with freezing air, giving warriors precise control over their own climate long before anyone had a word for that idea. The real advantage of all this was not just the warmth. It was that the entire structure moved. every piece packed down into components small enough to load onto a cart or a camel. And when the army stopped for the night, warriors did not build shelter from scratch. They reassembled the same system they had taken apart that morning, something they had done so many times it barely required thinking. A shelter that took 2 hours to raise but kept 50 men alive through a blizzard was worth more than one that went up in minutes and left half of them dead by morning. The Mongols understood that trade completely, and it is exactly why they could keep moving through weather that stopped every other army in the world cold.